Everybody, can everyone hear me? Have I got it right, Olivia? I have. Hope everyone's well and safe and all staying sane in these incredibly challenging times. My hair is getting worse with each webinar that I do. My other half cut my fringe, so hopefully it doesn't look too bad, although looking at it now, I'm not so sure. Right, we've got some questions sent through that we're going to run through today. We were hoping that we would have had some update on the revised furlough scheme, which will apply obviously from the 1st of August, but we haven't had that guidance come through. They'd said by the end of May, given that they like to divulge lots of information about these things on a Friday, I'd anticipate we'll get something out this Friday. And if that's the case, then don't worry, we'll get a webinar set up for next week with Olivia so that we can run through any questions that we've got about those changes. But just a bit of an overview on that from things that I do understand about what's going to happen with the schemes. So obviously with the current scheme and the way that it's laid out in terms of what you can do, what you can claim, that's going to operate as it is until the 31st of July. So it's not perceived that there's any changes to the scheme until we get to the end of July. From the 1st of August to the 31st of October, it seems that there's going to be a new way of actually operating that scheme, and there will be some quite significant changes. So firstly, the intention is that employees will be able to come back to work part-time. I know one of the questions that I've got is how can we introduce people back to work part-time, and I'll deal with that perhaps from a different angle. But clearly by statute, it's going to be the case that employees can come back and do some sort of work on a part-time basis from the 1st of August until the end of October. We don't know how that's going to work yet, but we need to bear that in mind, and perhaps, you know, we can start doing some forward thinking about that. Secondly, the change will be is that employers are going to have to contribute towards the costs of the employee's salary, whereas at the moment 80% is paid by the government without any contribution from the employer. Now, it's envisaged that that might be between 20 to 30%. And in all honesty, some of the emails I've been having from clients over the weekend, because obviously people want to get advice as urgently as possible, is that even if as anticipated, that payment is around 25%, a lot of businesses may not be able to afford that on top of their costs and obviously loss of income. So I think the change on the 1st of August with the contribution will either see companies relieved that they can get employees back to work in some fashion part-time, or in the alternative, difficult decisions having to be made because of the contribution. Now, what will apply is that those employees that can be furloughed between the 1st of August to the 31st of October have to have been furloughed at the 31st of July. So the reason that I'm letting you know that is for you to forward plan. So although we haven't got all the information in from the government, the indication is that these people who can continue to be furloughed from the 1st of October to the 1st of August to the 31st of October have to have been furloughed on the 31st of July. So if you think actually things are okay at the moment, but we might need to access the furlough scheme later in the year between the 1st of August and the 31st of October, if the employees aren't furloughed at the 31st of July, you won't be able to. So just think about that from a forward planning point of view. Couple of other changes. We'd been advised through government guidance that the records have to be retained in relation to those that are furloughed for a 5-year period. That's now been changed to a 6-year period. Finally, we've also had some more guidance around overtime. So where an employer is contractually obliged to pay overtime at a defined rate, that can be included within the calculations for pay that can be recovered through the furlough scheme. So just that bit of an overview on furlough with what we know so far. And as I say, I'm sorry that I can't give anything more updated at this point, but we'll do another webinar once we've got the info through. The other big news from today is to do with statutory sick pay, and the rebate scheme has been launched from today. So if you've got less than 250 employees, you can claim coronavirus-related statutory sick pay for 2 weeks per employee if the employee has been off sick with COVID, has self-isolated because of being in a home where there's been COVID, or have been shielding, although a lot of companies have obviously taken the decision to furlough those types of employees who've been self-isolating or been shielding. So having moved on from those couple of points which update you, it might be helpful now to run through the questions. The first of which is, how can we introduce people back to work part-time? Well, If this is linked to the coronavirus job retention scheme, then obviously we're going to have guidance from the government around how that will work in terms of the mix between remaining furlough for a period of time and also coming back to work part-time, and obviously what the contribution will be. In that situation, it's possible that there may be legislation that's passed that deals with that, which means that statute will override contracts. So whatever the statute says will enable us then to implement that with a view to getting staff back to work. In the alternative, and we have to revert back to the contract, if you've got a situation where employees can be placed on short-time working, obviously through their contract of employment, then that will enable you to assist them with coming back to work part-time as well. I'm hoping that that answers the question for that individual that raised that, but if not, I can deal with any more questions at the end. The second question we've got is, when can we start the part-time furlough? Well, obviously we've covered that over with the overview that I gave you. That's intended to start from the 1st of August and run through to the 31st of October. And obviously we'll discuss that further once we've got more information about it. The next question is to do with advice and clarity on holiday entitlement. Now, somebody else has raised a question as well about holidays, which I will deal with at the same time, but just advice and clarity on holiday entitlement. So firstly, whilst employees are on furlough, they continue to accrue their normal holiday entitlement. So that's the first point. We've had a situation where the government's introduced legislation, and this is somebody else's question. They've introduced legislation to say that if an employee cannot take their holiday because of COVID-19, then the holiday can be carried forward for 2 years, 2 further leave years after this leave year. So if you've got somebody that can't take their holiday, it can be carried forward for 2 years. In terms of if you wanted employees to take holiday, then in that situation, under the Working Time Directive, you can give notice to an employee, and it has to be double the length of notice for the amount of holiday that you want them to take. So for example, if it was a week's holiday you wanted them to take, then you'd need to give 2 weeks notice. If an employee wants to take their holiday, so they're requesting to take holiday, then again, there's no problem with you authorising that. And in fact, it may be within your interest to do so. In terms of pay and holiday, if an individual, either because they're instructed to take holiday by you or they've requested holiday, you have to top up their pay to 100% for any holiday days that are taken. So although you can continue to claim the 80% through the furlough scheme, you're required to top up the remaining amount. So it's a full amount that they're getting for any holiday that they take. Now, there was a question that somebody had raised around concerns for conflicting views on whether you can require employees to take holiday during furlough, because it's perceived that because of the limitations on what you can do, then it's not appropriate or reasonable for you to request employees to take their holiday. I take the view, especially with the slight easing of the lockdown now, that argument that it would be unreasonable to expect employees to take holiday is probably a little bit reduced. The risk is reduced because people can now go out for the day, for example. So I can tell you now that there's a member of my team that's on holiday this week, and I know that they've got days out planned where, yeah, okay, they're not going to be around lots and lots of people, but they're going to be taking the children out far wider than they would have done had it been perhaps, a couple of weeks ago before that lockdown was eased. So I think there's less of a risk of that happening. And also, if you have people who've been working from home, it's been quite normal for them to fire their laptop up every day. There's no reason why, if their laptop isn't fired up, they can't still take a period of leave and enjoy that leave, even if it doesn't involve them, being in a holiday home or a caravan somewhere or abroad. So I think at the end of the day, it's a balance, but I think most employees, if they know they're going to have the benefit, one, now of having slightly lesser restrictions on what they can do, and secondly, they're going to get topped up to full pay for any holiday that they take, then it's probably more reasonable to expect them to take the holiday, and you can probably give them notice to do so. So I think that probably addresses the points. Let me just check the questions on holiday. Yeah, I think that's all fine. I think that deals with all of those questions on that. So the next question is, we've received conflicting advice on consulting for redundancy whilst people are on furlough. ACAS say to bring them back into full pay, no furlough, and EEF say we can follow the process as this is not work. Okay, so this is quite a tough one, really, isn't it? And there's lots of issues, I think, that arise from redundancy at this time. When you've got a situation where you've got these employees on furlough, we were all very concerned right at the beginning about making sure there was some real transparency with individuals not doing any work at all, and then trying to work out what that means. And then obviously the government set out guidance around them being able to do training whilst they're on furlough, and now that they can take holiday whilst on furlough. It's also the case that if you've got employees that need to be disciplined or grievances are raised, then having regard to the limitations on how you carry out meetings, it can still be the case that those can take part and can happen whilst an employee is on furlough. So if you translate that across to a redundancy situation, if you were dealing with a disciplinary issue or a grievance issue, the employee would not be carrying out any work for the organisation. In a redundancy situation, to attend redundancy consultation meetings, for example, the employee would not be carrying out any work for the organisation. In addition, the guidance from the government makes it really clear that you can have a redundancy situation whilst people are on furlough. So I take the view that yes, if it's a situation where you've got employees on furlough, but you need to initiate redundancy procedures, you can do that whilst they remain on furlough. Now, having said that, there are other things that you need to think about in terms of that redundancy process. So firstly, you've got to think about the logistical obligations that arise from trying to do a virtual redundancy process. I mean, obviously, if you were to require the employee to come into the workplace to have a redundancy consultation meeting, you'd need to observe 2 metre distancing, etc. Personally, if there's a possibility of doing remote meetings virtually, just as we are doing now with this Zoom meeting, then that's probably the preferable thing to do. But you've got to have regard to different age groups and different people's abilities to access that type of equipment and that type of facility to be able to do those meetings. Of course, it's also open to you to do it by telephone. So my view overall is that, yeah, we can probably do redundancy processes whilst people are on furlough in the same way that you could do a redundancy process if somebody was on long-term sick leave. In terms of the logistics, we need to think about how that's going to be carried out fairly and how you can accommodate adjustments for people if they, for example, can't access certain equipment to have a Zoom meeting, and think about ways that is the best way that you can meaningfully consult with the employee. The second issue that arises in relation to redundancy is around selection pools and criteria. So you've got to be careful in exactly the same way, because the redundancy laws are all applicable even though an employee is on furlough. So you've got to think about, when you're putting together a criteria for selection or you're putting together a selection pool, that you follow the same rules that you would have done previously. So with no bias, with no elements of discrimination, and that everything's carried out transparently, fairly and reasonably. So that's something else that you'd need to think about. Another issue that's been raised is to do with pay during the notice period. So let's say we went through a redundancy process and the employee was furloughed. What would be their entitlement to pay during the notice period? Now, there's lots of conflicting views on this, and I'm hoping that we'll get some guidance from the government. I take the view as an employment lawyer that it will be this. There are situations where an individual, say for example if they're off sick and you give notice to terminate, or they give notice to terminate, will be entitled to their full pay even though they're not able to actually work the notice period. So that will apply in a situation where the employee's contract defines that their notice entitlement is the same as the statutory entitlement. If you've got a situation where you've got an employee whose notice period is at least 1 week more than the statutory minimum, so let's say I've been employed for 6 years, so by statute I should get 6 weeks notice, but actually my contract says that I should get 3 months notice, then the argument is that for that notice period they would only get furlough rate. So it's complicated, and as yet we don't have guidance. But I'm taking the view at the moment that if it's a situation where you are dismissing by reason of redundancy an employee who is furloughed and whose notice matches that of the statute, so a week for each year of continuous service up to a maximum of 12, they would get full pay for those notice period weeks. 80% of that, obviously, each week would be recoverable under the scheme. If it is somebody who has a longer notice period, then I believe your obligation may only be to pay the furloughed rate rather than the full rate. But again, we're going to need to wait for guidance on that. So hopefully that's just helped you in terms of the person that raised that question. The final issue then around redundancy is really whether or not you should be proceeding with the redundancy. And we've got no claims or no indication of how this is going to work out. But if you remember right at the beginning, in terms of the webinars that I ran, I raised this issue of, you know, if the scheme has been brought in to maintain people in jobs, and firstly, remember, of course, it was brought in on the basis that it would keep people in jobs who were going to be made redundant / laid off. The scheme has been widened now to enable people to be retained employment where the company's been severely affected by COVID-19. Then is there an obligation to maintain those people in furlough status for as long as you can until you then implement a redundancy process, which possibly with the introduction of the new scheme from the 1st of August might be retaining them until the 31st of July. Two schools of thought are: one, no, the scheme makes it clear that you can proceed with redundancies whilst the scheme is running, so there's no obligation to do so. The second school of thought is that, well, if you can keep people employed until you have to, and it's cost neutral because you're recovering all of their pay through the scheme, then it may be that an employee may try to bring a claim and say, well, actually, you should have kept me on the books and furloughed for that period of time rather than making me redundant, and therefore I believe it's an unfair dismissal. We have no guidance on that. We've not seen anything that would indicate one way or the other, but those are the risks. If you have a genuine redundancy situation and the furlough scheme being extended would have no bearing on that whatsoever, then it may be that if there is a genuine redundancy situation, you can still proceed on that basis. So hopefully that deals with the questions that was raised by somebody about furlough and redundancy. Somebody had raised a question about the carrying holiday forward for 2 years and it only applying to key workers. Just to be clear, it doesn't just apply to key workers. Any employee who's been prevented from taking their holiday because of COVID-19 can effectively carry their holiday forward to those 2 leave year periods. Then we've got... Somebody's raised a question. In terms of returning to work, if I have an employee currently furloughed who is the shielding category but need them to help with the effort of remobilising, but they feel unsafe in the actual workplace but can't work from home due to the nature of their job, where do I stand as an employer? They feel unsafe to come in, but I need them to do their job. Well, let's just think back, shall we, to the instructions given by the government. Firstly, the instruction was you were to remain at home if you can work from home. The second provision was if you cannot work from home, then you should be returning to work, but practicing safe distances. I don't know what the specifics are for this individual and whether or not they're one of those individuals that's received a letter from the government that says they have to stay at home for the 12-week period, or whether they're not, they're just somebody that is, you know, saying I need to shield because I have, for example, asthma or something like that. But in that situation, you've got to work with the employee to get them back to work as soon as possible. And you've got to undertake a risk assessment and look at their work, see how their work could be reorganised. So, for example, could they be coming in at a different time to when other people at work? Are there measures that you can take to make their workplace or workstation a safer environment? And discuss with them how you can relieve any of those anxieties that they've got around coming back into the workplace. Ultimately, if it is the case that they don't necessarily need to shield because they've not been instructed to do so by the government and they're just electing to do so, then ultimately your decision could be that they have to come back to work. And if they don't come back to work, then that may result in you either taking further action for them failing to follow that instruction, or it will affect their pay because clearly, there's an option for you there to not continue to furlough them. So without any further info, and I'm happy if you want to send some more info in that I can address that question further, but hopefully that answers what you needed to do so. Then the next question is, due to the nature of one role in the current climate, I have no work for them to do, but I have another who is stretched. Can I redeploy the employee with capacity to support the other one? Simply put, can I change their role? Ultimately, this will come down to you either having the right under the contract to vary their role, and very often, if you remember, you'll have a flexibility clause in the contract that says that although you're employed to do this work, we may require you to carry out work in accordance with the needs of the business. So have a look and see if you've got that type of clause. If you have, that's going to help you to sit down then and have conversations with the employee about what changes you need to make to facilitate both of those employees in employment during this quiet period for that particular employee. In the alternative, if you haven't got that type of clause, you can still consult with the employee about those changes to their role and their terms and conditions. So effectively, it's sitting down with the employee and reaching agreement with them about the changes. So hopefully, again, that's answered that question. The last question that I've got is really around home working. People saying advice about the excessive use of laptops at home without separate monitors. We do worry about neck, back, eye strain. And then I think somebody else had said in terms of home working about being sued for a bad back or something like that. So in terms of working from home, what responsibilities do I have as an employer around how an employee sets themselves up? This in terms of desk, chair, lighting, heating. Is there any potential around a claim, for example, for a bad back? So you need to remember, first of all, that an employee still has their own obligation to look after their own health and safety. So as much as you've got that obligation, they also have their own obligation to do that. If it came down to an equipment issue, you would be expected as the employer with employees working at home that you provide the correct equipment. So if it's a laptop, it's a laptop. A lot of people can stream from their laptop or plug into their main monitor at a desktop, for example, if they're set up at home and can work remotely. You should think about doing a risk assessment. So I know that may not be possible to do face-to-face, but you could do that over the phone and assess the workplace of the individual via a Zoom meeting, for example. You can go through and look at how they're working and do that type of assessment. If you've got employees in the workplace who have specific pieces of equipment when they're at work, so for example, a special chair, or other equipment, then really you would have an obligation to make sure that the employee has that equipment whilst they're working at home to try and relieve any possible consequences of their health being damaged because of the way that they're working at home. You'll need to, if you haven't put one in place, think about a home working policy, and within that it should address what your health and safety obligations are on both sides. So you need to remind employees to take their breaks. Says me, who struggles massively to step away from the laptop. But it's vital, especially when you're working from home and you haven't got the normal rules around it's 1 o'clock and everybody goes to lunch, to make sure that people are stopping to have their proper breaks away from their workstation as they should do by law. Mental health. Send out information to your employees about how they can preserve their mental health whilst they're working in this way. And again, although they're working from home, they are still working, so it's still your responsibility. So think about what contact they're having with the rest of the team, what contact they're having with you. Have they got enough support in place? Do they need extra equipment? Do they need to talk to you about training? What can you do that will help them to work from home better and obviously look after their mental health? The other thing to remind employees to do is to maintain their contractual hours. So the other thing that people seem to be doing, and a lot of this is around trying to look after children, which is incredibly difficult, but logging on at 5 o'clock in the morning because the other half's got to log on at 7, and then they look after the kids while they do that. That's all very well, but that's not sustainable long term. So it's really important that you talk to your staff about how they can arrange their hours to make sure that it's still going to maintain their health, and that actually they're not doing ridiculous hours to just try and fit in their hours of work. That's going to involve you guys being a bit more lenient, and obviously the employees trying not to be as flexible probably as they are being, which is all very admirable, but it can take a real toll on their health if that's the case. Reasonable adjustments is the other thing. I mentioned about the chair. You need to think about whether there's any adjustments that need to be made, and if you've done a risk assessment, then you'll know whether or not there's a need to consider anything like that. If you've done those things and you've worked through those things with the employee, it will lessen the risk of any potential claim if the employee says, well, you made me sit at home on this chair and it hurt my back and I wasn't taking any breaks, etc., and now I've got terrible back pains, or I've got some damage to my back. Then I think that's going to help to reduce those liabilities. So those are vital steps to take. I think that deals with hopefully all of the questions that everybody raised. So I'm happy to take any on top if anybody wants to ask any.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sally. Hopefully everyone that's in this group found that helpful and answered everything you wanted to be answered. I think if we've got sort of 10 or 15 minutes left of this afternoon session, and Sally's happy to, last time we did this, we had about 70 questions, so we might need to limit it. But if anyone has got any additional questions that they want Sally to try and help them with, then now is the time to put them in the group chat, and we will just kind of go down them from top to bottom. I think if you, this one's coming to me privately, which is fine, I can read that out loud. If you put it on everybody, there's a little drop down button that will either let you send it to an individual person or to everybody. If you send it to everybody, then the whole group can see all the questions that are in there. So I have had one, Sally, that I will read out if that's okay, because it's come to me privately. If an employee goes on holiday abroad and then they have to come back and isolate for 14 days, what do they get paid during that period?
That's an odd one, isn't it? I mean, there's a certain expectation that people aren't going to do this because of the impact on what's going to happen when they come back. But you can bet your bottom dollar that some people will take a foreign holiday and expect to be self-isolating. If they can self-isolate and work from home and they haven't got symptoms, then it's still the case that they should be paid their normal pay. That's if they are working. If they come back and they have actually got symptoms, then they will revert to whatever the sick pay entitlement is. So, you know, you then would be paying them effectively statutory sick pay because they've got COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that deals with that question. And of course, you'll say, please don't do that again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, thanks, Adele. We've had another one about holiday carry forward. Does this apply to statutory days or contractual?
It applies to statutory days. So with the contractual days, you can put limitations. So for example, I'll tell you what I've done with MFG. We have a situation where the employees obviously have no limit on the statutory holiday that can be carried over, but any contractual entitlement they have can be carried over into the next leave year, but has to be taken within a 3-month period. So you can set the rules around contractual. The statutory holiday can be carried forward.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that helped, Verity. Any other questions from anyone in the group? Now's the time to put them in the chat. I'm going to be shocked if there isn't any.
Obviously, I've talked about complete nonsense. That's what it is. No, I'm joking.
Okay. Well, I'll just do my closing remarks then if no one's got any, and if there is one I'll come back to it, but I do just like to give people a minute to type out. What I thought might be really helpful, especially for this group, there is some more, so I will come back to that, but just as I started to talk about, with this group being predominantly people that are looking after people, I thought these few webinars might be useful for you to know about as well. Tomorrow we're doing a webinar at 12 o'clock, completely free to members, based around risk assessment. And I know Sally's mentioned that a little bit in this webinar today. If you want to come along to that one, then let me know. It's 12 o'clock tomorrow. We've then got one on Tuesday next week, which is Tuesday the 2nd. And that is how employers can support their staff through their mental well-being during this crisis as well. So if anyone wants to attend either of those webinars, then let me know. Just going to move back onto one of the questions. It's a fairly lengthy one. Sally, can you see the group chat, or do you want me to read it out?
Can you read it out? Because I'm not sure I'm as
no, that's
Zoom
fine.
literate as you.
No, that's fine. Right, okay, bear with me then. We have an individual who's going on maternity leave in July. They are currently furloughed until the end of June. She hasn't been with us long enough for SMP, so we'll be claiming maternity allowance. Would we keep her on furlough until she starts? Then she has to claim the maternity allowance from the government.
Yes. Yeah. So unless, of course, the baby comes early, in which case it'll trigger her maternity leave early anyway. But yeah, there's no problem in you keeping her furloughed until then, and then she'll need to go off and claim her maternity allowance if she's not been with you long enough to be able to claim SMP from you. Okay. Yeah, just got a thanks. No, that's okay, no problem. Any other questions from anybody? I'm just going to quickly have a look on my videos just to see if anyone's
waving at me in case I've ignored them. Yeah, okay.
I think one just came up.
Yeah, I had another one. So we have ex-employees who were re-employed to furlough. Do we just keep them on furlough, or would we take them off the scheme when our other employees return?
So presumably you've re-engaged them, but they were to be laid off and made redundant, or just simply terminated. Is that right?
Just waiting. No, they were ex-employees.
So you had ex-employees and you re-engaged them purely to be put onto the furlough scheme. Yeah. So, and then what your intention will be is you've got other employees who are also furloughed at the moment. And then they're going to be, and then they're going to be coming back to work. Yeah. And then what happens with the people who were ex-employees that are then, So when you, hopefully when you took the people back on that were ex-employees purely for the purposes of furloughing, you informed them that that's exactly what you were doing, that they weren't simply coming back and suddenly would have all this continuous service and then you'd have to go through hoops to try and terminate their employment again. If it was the case that they were re-engaged purely for the furlough scheme and you'd advise them of that, it should just be a matter of you giving notice to terminate. Otherwise, it seems daft, doesn't it, that you'd have to go through all the normal processes to bring their employment to an end simply because of the decision to end the furlough scheme. And I would suspect that your consideration to do that will be the end of July when you've got to start contributing, because it doesn't seem right that, you know, if you have just simply engaged them purely to take advantage of that scheme, that you should then have to top up or contribute in any way from the 1st of August onwards. So it should be just terminating their employment. And hopefully, you say ex-employees, there was a long enough break between them finishing and them being re-engaged so that they can't argue that there was any sort of continuity of service.
Okay. Is there a legal obligation to confirm points met for employees to return to work? Is there something to fill in?
Sorry, say again, I missed that.
Is there a legal obligation to confirm points met for employees to return to work? Is there something to fill in?
Do you mean in relation to health and safety? What do you mean in relation to? Can you just clarify that?
No, I'm not sure. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, there isn't. There's lots of guidance. The government has produced guidance, and I don't know if you've all seen it all, but it's actually quite helpful for each type of workplace. So if you had an office environment, for example, or you were on a construction site, or you were on, I don't know, a manufacturing shop floor, they've listed out lots of ways that you can look at what you need to do to make a safe environment. And to be fair, that gives you pretty much a green light in terms of what you should be doing and what boxes you need to tick to make sure that you have, you know, put in place the appropriate measures. So, for example, if it's an office environment, you know, should you be marking out the floor for 2 metre distancing so that people are, you know where to stand to stay away from each other? Have you thought about perspex screens around the desks or other areas which, you know, people are working in so that they've got that sort of spatial cover to make sure that, you know, if people are walking past, they're still protected? Putting in place masks, although that's not essential. Thinking about your high touch areas, so, you know, the kitchens, the toilets, the door handles, you know, rotating your staff, so, you know, changing hours of work, whether you're going to have people coming in the evening now rather than just 9 to 5 as a way of splitting people up to make it again more safe. There isn't anything in particular, but those are the things, if you look at that guidance, those are the sort of things that you should be able to say to your staff, right, these are the measures, this is what we've done, this is why we're saying we've got a safe workplace for you to return to. I think the lady with the other question had come back and clarified something.
Yeah, it was just about the employees left at the end of February, and just thanks for the help.
Oh, that's fine. Plenty of time then. Yeah.
So I've got another one that's coming to me privately, so I'm just gonna read it out. It's a fairly lengthy one, so just bear with me again. We planned on starting furlough from the 1st of April. We were advised to encourage employees to take some holiday at the start so that they were paid 100% and that they wouldn't all take their accrued leave when we all got back up and running, which is, I think, the same as everyone else. We didn't claim furlough for their holiday period. Is this correct? also, are you suggesting they can take leave anytime they are on furlough, or have I misunderstood?
So they can take leave anytime they're on furlough. That's the first question. My understanding of how the scheme works is if you have an employee that's on holiday, you can claim the 80% as normal, but you have to top up to 100% for the rest of the pay. So if you didn't claim for it, you should have claimed for it. So you need to look and see whether you can now claim for it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Last chance. Okay. I'm going to leave it there then, everyone. I'd just like to leave a minute in case anybody is typing manically, but I can't see that anybody is. So I hope you all found that really useful. A massive thank you to Sally for joining us this afternoon and always sharing so much wisdom and advice to the group. So a massive thank you and virtual round of applause to you, Sally. So thank you. Just want to also say thank you to all of you for joining. It was lovely to see so many of you and see so many lovely smiley faces. If some more legislation comes out this week and any more information from the government about the part-time furlough, Sally and I will really quickly organise a webinar next week, and I will make sure you all are aware of the date and the time as soon as we've organised it. And if there's anything else you need from me, or if you would like me to put you in touch with Sally as well, then let me know. If there's anything else we can help with, we'd be more than happy to. But it was lovely to see you all. Thank you again to Sally, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.